Major John Barrett, an 84-year-old Vietnam War hero, is traveling to Washington for a Medal of Honor ceremony, a trip arranged by his devoted granddaughter, Emily. Despite holding a confirmed first-class ticket, John is unexpectedly downgraded to a cramped middle economy seat due to an airline's equipment change and rigid policies. The cold reassignment ignites a quiet battle between dignity and bureaucracy as John grapples with being unseen despite his sacrifices. But when he calls a special heroes liaison number, a powerful airline CEO personally intervenes, setting in motion a remarkable restoration of honor, proving sometimes true respect comes not from applause, but from quiet recognition. If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe to my channel for more inspiring tales of courage and quiet strength. Share this video with friends who believe in honoring true sacrifice. Together, we keep these stories alive and remind the world what real dignity truly means. "There's been an aircraft change," she said flatly, handing him a flimsy boarding pass as if it were nothing more than a receipt. "You've been reassigned to seat 33B. That's a middle seat economy." Major John Barrett looked down at the new boarding pass, then back at the first-class ticket he'd held on to for weeks, a gift from his granddaughter, something she'd proudly saved up for to ensure he could attend the White House ceremony with dignity. He didn't protest, not in the way some might. His voice remained level, calm, unwavering. "There must be a mistake," he said, meeting the agent's eyes. But she just shrugged, already turning back to her screen. "Aircraft changes happen, sir. This is your seat now." No apology, no pause, no sign that she recognized the name or the man standing before her. Just a mechanical response and a dismissive gesture. The finality of it stung, not in the way of anger, but in the quiet erosion of dignity that comes when the world forgets to care. 8 minutes passed. The crowd around the terminal bustled, families wrangling children, solo travelers clutching coffee cups, the familiar churn of movement and impatience. Then the energy shifted. People paused, heads turned, the gate agents stiffened. Assistants rushed forward, murmuring urgently into radios. At the center of it all, a man in a suit, his forehead slick with sweat, moving briskly toward the podium. "Where is he?" the man demanded breathlessly. "Where is Major John Barrett?" The name was not one many in the terminal recognized, but for those who knew even fragments of history, it carried weight. Major John Barrett never spoke much about the war, not because it had faded from his memory, but because the memories never left him. At 84, the wounds weren't visible to most, but they were there, in the way he moved slower than others, in the careful way he settled into chairs, in the instinctual scan of every room he entered. He had been a special forces officer in Vietnam, a leader whose courage wasn't defined just by what he faced in battle, but by the impossible missions he brought his men home from. Against every odd, when no one else believed they'd make it back, he made sure they did. He was their anchor, their unspoken hope. Now, decades later, he lived quietly in the outskirts of Des Moines, Iowa. A small house, a loyal dog named Duke, and an American flag that still flew proudly out front, even through the harshest winters. Time had slowly chipped away at his world. Friends were gone. His beloved Helen had passed 5 years earlier. His only close family now was Emily, his granddaughter, Captain Emily Barrett, a logistics officer stationed at Fort Carson, Colorado. She was his link to the world beyond the quiet stillness of his days. The rest of society may have moved on, but Emily never forgot. So when she heard her grandfather had been invited to a White House event honoring Medal of Honor recipients, she didn't hesitate. She dug deep, used every frequent flyer mile she had, dipped into her own modest savings, and booked him a first-class seat on Trans-Meridian Airlines. She knew his back wouldn't tolerate hours crammed in coach. But more than that, she knew what this ceremony meant. She knew what he meant. "This isn't about comfort, Grandpa," she told him over the phone. "It's about dignity." John had laughed gently. "You always were the idealist, Em." "Just let me do this," she said. "You've earned it." And maybe he had, but in John's heart, he still struggled with that. The real heroes, he believed, were the ones who didn't make it home. The names carved into black granite in Washington, D.C., they were the ones who had earned ceremonies and applause. Still, he wouldn't take away Emily's pride. So he packed carefully, his best suit, shoes he hadn't worn in years but polished anyway, and made the 2-hour drive to the airport early, just as he had always done in the service. On time, disciplined, ready. The terminal had been its usual blur of motion. Announcements crackled overhead. People rushed past with heads down, eyes glued to screens. No one noticed the elderly man walking with a slight limp, carrying a worn leather duffel, his shoulders too square for the civilian jacket he wore. He didn't expect a welcome party. He didn't want special attention. But quietly, somewhere deep inside, he hoped the system would remember that a man's service, a confirmed seat, and a commitment to duty still mattered in some way. But in today's world, loyalty was a currency measured in points, not valor. And the airline didn't see decades of sacrifice. It saw a name on a screen, a name that could be replaced with a few keystrokes. There was no reverence in the algorithm, no honor coded into the system. And so what unraveled that morning wasn't just a reservation. It was a man's silent expectation that dignity might still carry weight. The terminal pulsed around him, full of the chaotic rhythm of travel, rolling luggage, gate changes murmured through intercoms, and the rhythmic beep of boarding passes. Major John Barrett moved deliberately through the noise, his pace measured, posture straight. He reached gate 28 early, as always, ticket in hand, ready. Behind the gate counter stood Denise. Her expression was composed, her navy blazer pressed into stiff lines. She had the air of someone who dealt with countless difficult travelers and had long since stopped trying to empathize. Beside her, Kyle, younger and anxious, flicked his gaze between the crowd and the screen, unsure of himself. John offered his boarding pass, seat 2A, first class. He'd confirmed it twice. It was nothing extravagant, just a window seat, some legroom, a little piece on a long flight. Reasonable for an aging veteran traveling cross-country to be honored by the commander-in-chief. Denise scanned the pass. The screen flashed red. She frowned and began typing without a word. Click, click, click. Then, without looking up, she tore a slip from the printer and held it out. "There's been an aircraft change," she said flatly. She delivered the news with no emotion, her voice flat and clinical. "The new configuration has fewer first-class seats." He glanced down at the paper in her hand. Row 33, seat bid a middle seat in economy. "There must be a mistake," he said, keeping his tone level, refusing to let frustration rise. But before the other agent could speak, Denise jumped in, her words clipped with a sharp impatience. "It's not a mistake, sir. You were booked using loyalty miles, not cash fare. That places you lower in the priority list when adjustments are made. We had to reassign several seats. Yours is now 33B. John looked again at the boarding slip. 33B, it might as well have said, "You don't matter." He didn't speak for a moment. The distant hum of the terminal filled the silence, buzzing in his ears like radio static. Finally, he said slowly and with quiet dignity, "I'm traveling to Washington for a Medal of Honor event." Denise gave a dismissive shrug. "That's noted in your reservation, but it doesn't override our seating policy. Priority goes to full fare Diamond members." Beside her, Kyle shifted awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable. He opened his mouth to say something, maybe to interject or apologize, but Denise's sharp glance cut him off before a word escaped. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, just the cold efficiency of a corporate script read too many times. John took the boarding pass gently. "Thank you," he said, his voice calm but firm, because manners were something you held on to, even when no one else did. Major John Barrett walked slowly to a seat near the terminal window. The gate area was crowded and noisy. Bawled by Menady, chattering families tapping keyboards, the occasional child's shriek. But at least the view of the tarmac gave him somewhere to rest his thoughts. He studied the slip of paper in his hand again. Row 33, seat B, middle seat. The code felt less like a boarding assignment and more like a verdict. Everything he had endured, everything he had given, reduced now to a flimsy, impersonal printout. He said nothing, didn't argue. That part of him, the officer who once commanded men under fire, had long ago learned that sometimes silence carried more weight than protest. The world moved on around him. Business travelers barked into phones, children darted between legs, laughter and sighs overlapped like the weaving of an indifferent crowd. And in the middle of it, sat an aging man in a navy blue blazer, one hand gripping a battered duffel bag, the other slowly rubbing the spot on his lower back where pain had nested for years. He thought about calling Emily, his granddaughter. Just hearing her voice would help, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. She'd tried so hard to make this trip meaningful, spending her own money, taking time off, staying up late to book everything just right. She didn't need to know what had happened. He didn't want her to feel like she had failed. And more than that, he refused to let the system win. Not through her, not through shame. So he sat in silence, letting his breath steady the ache in his chest. He'd been here before, not in airports, but in moments that looked the same. VA offices, government waiting rooms, job interviews after the war, where medals didn't mean much and silence was met with indifference. He had long since learned that respect wasn't always handed to you. Sometimes you had to carry it alone, a quiet weight you never put down. He looked back toward gate 28. Denise was still there, scanning another boarding pass like she was swiping groceries. Kyle stood nearby, eyes averted. He didn't hate them. They weren't villains, just cogs in a machine built to serve policies, not people. That's what hurt the most. It wasn't about luxury. It wasn't even about comfort. It was about being seen, about the quiet dignity of recognition, not celebration, not applause, just the acknowledgement that what he had done mattered. But the message was clear. It didn't. Not to them. Not today. John sat quietly, watching a baggage cart rattle past on the tarmac. The ache in his lower back throbbed with every passing minute, but he paid it no mind. That pain had become a familiar companion, part of the price. He shifted slightly, folding the boarding pass and tucking it carefully into the inner pocket of his blazer. His thoughts drifted again to Emily. She would be crushed if she knew. She had done everything she could to make this trip special, to remind him that he was more than just another old man lost in a crowd. He'd agreed to the trip because it meant something to her, because it was her way of saying, "I see you, Grandpa." Reaching into his wallet to pull out a tissue for his glasses, his fingers brushed against a small card tucked between old receipts and worn identification. He froze. On it, in Emily's handwriting, were 4 words. "Call this if needed." Above the words was a printed logo. Trans-Meridian Airlines, Heroes Liaison Desk. He stared at the card. He wasn't the kind of man who called special numbers. He didn't ask for favors, didn't look for exceptions. But he remembered her voice from a phone call just a few weeks back. "If anything goes wrong, Grandpa, anything, you don't argue. You call that number. It goes past everything. That's what it's for. It's for people like you." He hesitated. Then slowly, deliberately, as if every motion had to be cleared by some unspoken code of pride, he pulled out his phone and dialed. 2 rings, then a voice. "Trans-Meridian Heroes Liaison. This is David. How may I assist you today?" John straightened in his seat. "Yes, my name is Major John Barrett. I had a confirmed first-class ticket on Flight 714 to Washington. I've just been downgraded. I'm traveling to attend a Medal of Honor ceremony." There was a pause on the line, not the dismissive kind that signaled boredom or distraction, but the stillness that descends when someone realizes they've stepped onto sacred ground. "Yes, sir. May I confirm your booking number and gate location?" came the voice, now more measured, more respectful. John provided the information. "Please hold, Major Barrett." The silence that followed felt different this time. It wasn't empty or indifferent. It was focused. He could hear typing, fast, deliberate, purposeful. Then the voice returned, steadier now. "Major Barrett, I see your record, and I see exactly what just happened. Sir, I want to offer you my sincerest apologies. This is absolutely not how we handle matters involving our honored veterans, especially not those attending federal ceremonies. Yes, the equipment change was legitimate, but the way your seating reassignment was processed completely disregarded our internal protocols for distinguished guests like yourself. I'm escalating this immediately. Please remain at gate 28. Someone will be there to assist you shortly." John blinked, unsure how to respond. "Thank you," he said softly. The voice replied without hesitation. Thank you, sir. We'll fix this. Then the call ended. John slowly returned his phone to his pocket and scanned the gate area around him. Nothing had changed. Families still chatted, earbuds still buzzed with music. The overhead announcements droned on. The world continued turning as if nothing had happened. But for the first time, it felt like someone, somewhere beyond the polished walls and rehearsed customer service, had truly seen him. Not as a reservation number, not as another complication in the system, but as a man who mattered. He didn't allow himself to believe too much. Decades of broken promises had taught him better. Bureaucracy had a way of swallowing good intentions whole. Still, there was something in the way the man, David, had said it. We'll fix this. It didn't feel like the empty echo of an apology. It had the tone of someone preparing to move mountains. And so, for the first time since the downgrade, Major John Barrett leaned back in his chair. He raised his gaze from the speckled floor tiles and waited. Not with resentment, not with wounded pride, but with the quiet certainty of a man who'd finally reached someone who could move the needle. Nothing happened. At first, 7 minutes passed. Gate 28 continued its measured rhythm. The robotic voice announced boarding groups in a soft, detached tone. Wheels of carry-ons rolled across the floor like distant thunder. People murmured, brows furrowed, preoccupied with the business of getting from here to there. John sat motionless, his phone resting beside him, as if it too waited. Then something shifted. It was barely perceptible at first. A flicker, a ripple of attention. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Gate agents glanced up from their screens. Even a TSA officer near the concourse entrance straightened, alert. Then they appeared. A small group in tailored suits and corporate lanyards moved with sharp precision down the concourse, cutting through the crowd like a current. There was a charge in the air, not of noise, but of urgency. At the center was a tall man in his early 50s, sweat glistening on his temples, his suit slightly rumpled from the pace. His face carried the weight of purpose, focused, intense, almost frantic. Elliot Granger, CEO of Transmeridian Airlines, didn't slow until he reached the podium at Gate 28. Denise, the gate agent, froze mid-scan. Kyle, her colleague, instinctively took a step back. A hush fell over the area. Travelers stopped talking. Some stood still with boarding passes half raised. "Where is he?" Granger asked, voice tight and clipped. Denise, eyes wide, gestured uncertainly toward the window seated. "That man, over there?" Granger didn't wait for clarification. He strode across the floor and stopped directly in front of John. John looked up, surprised. The man before him looked like he didn't belong, not because of his suit, but because of his expression, a mix of urgency and sincerity rarely seen in corporate circles. "Major Barrett," the man began, lowering his voice. "Sir, I'm Elliot Granger. I'm the president of Transmeridian Airlines." John gave a slow nod, not yet sure what to make of this. "I want to personally apologize for what just happened. What you experienced wasn't just a mistake. It was a total failure of everything we claim to stand for. The error in your reassignment should never have occurred, and I take full responsibility." John opened his mouth to respond, but Granger pressed on. "We're holding the flight. You will be escorted directly to first class, and not just any seat. We're restructuring the cabin to ensure you are accommodated properly. If that means removing one of our own executives, then that's exactly what we'll do." Behind Granger, a staffer was already on a call, nodding quickly as they juggled seating arrangements. John glanced around. All eyes were on him now. But there was no mockery, no condescension, only respect. Curiosity, yes, but not the kind that turns people into spectacles. The kind that honored what was unfolding. Granger straightened. "Major Barrett, it should never have come to this, but I give you my word, your name will never be forgotten in our system again." From his coat, he pulled out a sleek leather folder and handed it to John. "This is a lifetime travel voucher. Anytime you or your family flies with Transmeridian, any destination, anytime, you'll fly in our highest service class. No exceptions. Consider this a small gesture for the honor we failed to give you today." John blinked slowly, then nodded. "Thank you," he said, his voice even but touched with something deeper. Something not quite pride, not quite gratitude. It was recognition. The quiet kind that says, "You saw me." Finally. And as the entourage gathered around him and began to lead him toward the jet, Major John Barrett rose, not just to board a plane, but to meet a moment long overdue. The passengers quietly stepped aside as the old soldier walked through the jet bridge. Some applauded softly, others simply watched in a respectful hush. There were no grand gestures from him, no waves, no bows. He moved with purpose, shoulders square, eyes forward, dignity unmistakably intact. When Flight 714 finally lifted off the ground, it was 23 minutes behind schedule, yet not a single passenger appeared to mind the delay. In fact, as they settled into their seats, many of them kept glancing toward 1A, not with annoyance, but with a quiet reverence, fully aware of the man seated there. Major John Barrett reclined slightly, his eyes closed, the rigid tension that had gripped his body slowly ebbing away. In that seat, for the first time in a long while, he felt seen. Not celebrated, not showcased, just recognized. It had been the airline's CEO himself, Elliot Granger, who had walked him down the jet bridge, a deliberate and personal gesture. Granger had stayed until Barrett was seated and had made sure the crew treated him not with rehearsed lines or forced cheerfulness, but with authentic, unfeigned respect. But while the aircraft soared into the sky, far below at the terminal, a very different atmosphere was brewing. The incident wasn't over. In fact, it had just started. Less than an hour after takeoff, the top floor of Transmeridian's corporate headquarters was lit up for an emergency meeting. This wasn't being filed away as a PR blunder. It was being addressed as something far deeper, a breach in company culture. Granger stood at the head of the boardroom table, composed but resolute. His voice didn't rise, but the weight behind every word struck hard. This wasn't a seat assignment mistake, he began. This was a failure to recognize. Around him sat the senior leadership team, battle-hardened executives used to speaking in numbers, margins, and stock performance. But none of that shielded them now. They were silent, because Granger wasn't talking about spreadsheets. He was talking about values. Our system failed to flag that a Medal of Honor recipient was flying under official government orders, he continued. But more than that, our frontline staff didn't know how to respond when someone of that caliber stood before them. He didn't rant or accuse, he explained, and then he acted. Effective immediately, Granger said, we are putting a new protocol in place. Any veteran traveling under distinguished circumstances will be automatically flagged for executive review. No more relying entirely on automated logic. I want a manual override system, something that goes beyond algorithms and remembers the human behind the ticket. He turned to the VP of Customer Experience. Expand empathy training, not just teaching our staff how to apologize. Teach them how to see people. The VP was already scribbling down notes with urgency. But it didn't end there. Denise, the gate agent who had reassigned Barrett's seat without a second thought, was pulled from all customer-facing roles. She wasn't fired, not yet. Granger didn't believe in knee-jerk punishments. He believed in accountability with the opportunity to grow. Denise was enrolled in a 6-week retraining course focused on human-centered service, with the possibility of returning only after successful completion. Kyle, the younger agent who had witnessed the incident and quietly submitted a report afterward, was not overlooked. His discomfort had been subtle but clear, and it had been noted. An internal memo later commended his integrity. Granger met with him in person. They shook hands, and Granger said only one thing: we need more people like you. News of what happened spread across the company faster than any official press release. Employees forwarded the memo. Passengers secretly filmed clips of Granger's public apology at the gate were shared widely online, picked up by veterans forums and social media. The airline still faced criticism, rightfully so, for the oversight in the first place. But something deeper was happening too. Among those who had worn the uniform, there was a recognition, not of a perfect corporation, but of one that had been made to pause and remember what matters. Soon after, the company released an official document titled The Barrett Protocol. It detailed emergency procedures, special honors travel guidelines, liaison assignments, and most notably, a manual override clause for seating logic. At the top of the first page, centered and in bold, were just 10 words: service before status, people before points. Major John Barrett never saw the memo. He never asked to. He hadn't requested new rules or apologies or attention. He had demanded nothing. And yet, by standing silently, by refusing to disappear, he had managed to reshape the very system that had failed to see him. Sometimes the most lasting change begins not with outrage or headlines, but with the quiet, unwavering dignity of a man who chooses not to be erased. The limousine moved quietly through the sun-dappled streets of Washington, D.C., its tinted windows shielding its lone occupant from the outside world. Spring had awakened the city. Bicyclists zipped through traffic in pressed suits. Tourists clustered on sidewalks with cameras raised. Government workers spilled out of buildings for lunch breaks. But Major John Barrett sat apart from it all, untouched by the motion and noise. His hands rested calmly in his lap. Beside him was the same weathered duffel bag that had traveled with him through the steaming jungles of Vietnam, across dozens of airport terminals, and now into the heart of the capital he had once fought for. He hadn't come for the monuments or the grandeur. He hadn't asked for this moment, and yet, deep in his chest, he carried a quiet appreciation for being remembered. At the White House gates, military personnel coordinated his arrival with seamless precision. There were no press flashes, no red carpet, only discreet efficiency and the respectful nods of those who understood exactly who he was, without needing to say it. Inside the East Room, chandeliers sparkled above a modest gathering of guests, decorated veterans, dignitaries, and a few quiet observers. There were no cameras. The ceremony was not for public broadcast. It wasn't staged for applause. It was simply a tribute. John Barrett stood among the other living recipients of the Medal of Honor. Though he had never cared much for titles or accolades, he remained upright, shoulders squared, his eyes steady as they called his name. Every step he took forward echoed, not just through the ceremonial hall, but in the deep recesses of his memory. He moved deliberately, with the weight of years and battles trailing behind him like a silent shadow. When he reached the president, the handshake was firm, but the words that followed held far more weight. Only this: you carried more than most could ever imagine, Major Barrett. Thank you. The applause that followed was genuine, warm, without performance. John nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement, and returned to his seat with no fanfare. No speech, no gestures, just presence. That was his way. After the ceremony, others mingled, shared stories, posed for photographs, basked in the nostalgia of shared sacrifice. But John kept mostly to himself. He received every handshake with a nod of gratitude, a slight smile, but turned away from the spotlight. Recognition had never been the point. Not at the airport, not here. Later that evening, back at his hotel room, he sat by the window in a crisp white shirt and simple slacks. The city stretched before him, the Potomac glinting in the last light of day. Arlington stood still in the distance, stoic and eternal. In that rare moment of silence, he let himself breathe, just once, deeply. A breath of peace. Then his phone buzzed. A message lit up the screen. It was from Emily. Heard something went wrong at the gate. Are you okay? He stared at the message for a long time. The memory of that day, Denise's cold, detached tone, the flimsy boarding pass stamped with 33B, surfaced like a ghost. But so did another image, softer this time. Elliot Granger on one knee, apologizing not as a CEO, but as a man who had finally understood. John typed slowly. All good, just a little turbulence on the ground. Cleared up quickly. Ceremony went well. You'd have been proud. He paused, then added, thank you, kiddo, for everything. He set the phone down and gazed back at the lights flickering across the skyline like distant constellations. There was no need to relive the pimp, no need to explain. Some burdens, the pain, the moments of grace, the quiet resilience it takes to carry on, aren't stories to be told. They're meant to be born. And that night, John Barrett didn't feel ignored or dismissed or forgotten. He felt remembered. His story never made the national headlines. There were no flashy segments on cable news, no viral hashtags, no trending clips. But inside quiet places, military bases, VFW halls, airport staff lounges, his name was spoken in low tones of respect. The man who didn't raise his voice, but who changed the rules. The Barrett crypto call became more than just a policy update. It became a quiet reminder. Behind every passenger name in a booking system might lie a legacy deeper than a frequent flyer status or a seat class. In a world chasing upgrades, perks, and bottom lines, some things still couldn't be quantified by numbers or money. John never flew again after that trip to Washington. Not out of bitterness. He had been given what truly mattered. One last flight, not marked by luxury, but by dignity. That was enough. He returned to Iowa, resumed his quiet life, lived with the same humility that had always defined him. He never hung the lifetime pass on the wall, never brought up Elliot Granger's name again. And when Emily asked him about it one last time, he simply said, "They did right by me in the end, that's what matters." But others remembered. Gate agents shared the story in orientation. Airline training manuals quietly adopted it as a case study, and whenever someone dared to brush off a passenger marked with a distinguished military title, someone nearby would lean in and say, "Don't forget about Barrett," because real honor doesn't announce itself. It walks quietly until it's needed. It doesn't ask for first class, it deserves it. And when those in power finally stop to say, "We failed you and we'll fix it," that moment, that choice isn't just service recovery, it's redemption. So next time you're at an airport and you spot an elderly man shuffling slowly through the terminal, don't just glance at his boarding pass, look at him. You might be standing beside someone who carried more than a bag, someone who carried history. In an age where attention spans are shrinking and loyalty is measured in app points and bonus miles, Major Barrett's story reminds us that true respect isn't earned in transactions. It's lived, carried, and remembered. How many times do we pass someone with silver hair and a steady gait, never once imagining the battles they fought, not just overseas, but here, quietly at home? John never asked for applause. He simply asked not to be forgotten. And maybe that's the most powerful lesson of all, that dignity once lost doesn't scream. It disappears silently until someone brave enough stands still long enough to make the world notice. So now the question comes to you. Have you ever witnessed a moment like that, where one person's silent strength shifted something larger than themselves? Do we, as a society, still recognize sacrifice when it walks by in silence? If this story touched something in you, please share it, not for views or numbers, but for remembrance. Because here we don't just tell stories, we preserve them. And sometimes remembering is the first act of honor.